Hey, everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Got a debate for you. Is transubstantiation true? That is what we're going to go over. Is it true? Is it biblical, especially? So, we are going to have a debate between Luis Dizon and Dale Glover. Lewis is a Catholic and Dale is a Protestant. We just had a debate 2 days ago between the two debaters here on the question of baptismal regeneration and whether or not that is biblical. So go and check that one out as well. But I'm excited to host this one. So we're going to have, for today's format, two 20-minute opening statements, then two 10-minute rebuttals, followed by a 40-minute period where there will be informal discussion. After that, we'll have two 5-minute closings and then Q&A at the end. So hold off on your questions until towards the end. Well, gentlemen, welcome back to the show. Dale, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. I had a fantastic time with you guys on Monday. In terms of the baptism debate, I thought it went really well. Both Lewis and I made great points and stuff like that. So it was awesome and seemed like the audience liked it as well.
Yeah, they did. And I really enjoyed it and benefited from it. So excited about this one. I'm sure it's going to be just as productive. Lewis, welcome back. How are you?
Oh, doing pretty well. Spent the past couple of days resting and preparing for this debate. I actually realized that given some of the stuff that happened 2 days ago, I don't think a simple repeat of my earlier presentation will do. So I actually have been modifying my presentation in the past couple of days. So there will be material I'm presenting that wasn't part of the initial presentation. So sorry, Dale, if I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball.
All right. So just so the audience, my rebuttal will be responding to old stuff then. But yeah, no, that's good. We got to update and stuff.
Yeah, well, fair enough. Well, I'm excited about this. So, Lewis, since you're taking the affirmative position, you're going to go first. I got my timer here set to 20 minutes. If you want around the 2-minute mark, I can jump in and just give a 2-minute warning, although I think you're taking time. So,
yes.
Do you want me to come in and interject and say 2 minutes, or would that just be too much?
Yeah, that would be good. Although I will also be checking on my end. So,
okay.
It's good to have more than one. So
sure.
I'll start the timer as soon as you put my slides up.
Cool. All right. So if you're ready to roll, I'll give you a 3-second countdown. 3, 2, 1. All right.
All right. So I am going to be arguing the affirmative for transubstantiation. Now, the title of my presentation is The Eucharist as Christ's Real Presence. So real presence and transubstantiation are not strictly the same thing because there are multiple real presence theories. And if I'm going to defend the Catholic view, that does give Dale a little bit of an advantage because the more specific you are in your view, the tighter the defense has to be, because I have to argue for a specific mode of Christ's real presence. So to start off, I'm going to talk a little bit about what Catholics view the Eucharist as. So as I mentioned in my earlier presentation, there are basically three things that we view the Eucharist as. We consider the Eucharist as, one, a thanksgiving and praise to the Father. That's fairly uncontroversial. I don't think that Dale will disagree with that. We view it also as a sacrificial memorial of Christ and his body. That's where it gets a little bit controversial, because even though the Eucharist is acknowledged by all sides to be a memorial, we differ over what it means for it to be a memorial. So we'll delve into what anamnesis means in the worldview of the early Christians. And then finally, the Eucharist is the presence of Christ by the power of his word and of his spirit. So this is where the idea of real presence comes in. So as I mentioned, there are different theories on Eucharistic presence. And in the Catholic tradition, particularly, we have conceived of Christ's presence in the Eucharist in terms of a change in the substance of the elements while retaining the accidents of bread and wine. Now, critics of this kind of language have suggested that this subordinates Christian theology to Aristotelian philosophy, thus confusing the two. However, as Bishop Barron has noted in his book, This Is My Body, though it will consistently use a word marked by Aristotle's philosophy, the church by no means ties itself thereby to Aristotelian metaphysics in the articulation of its Eucharistic faith. So we don't need to think of it in Aristotelian terms, strictly speaking. In fact, Bishop Barron himself has suggested that we use the terms appearance and reality to articulate the same kind of doctrine, just without the baggage of Aristotelian language. But even if we use the old terms, that doesn't mean that we're bound to accept the same, the kind of metaphysical concepts that Aristotle imported into them. Now, we're going to delve primarily on the New Testament texts that are most relevant. So we're going to look at the Bread of Life discourse in John 6, and then we're going to look at the Last Supper narratives, and then what St. Paul had to say in 1 Corinthians. And then I'm going to say a little bit at the end, Lord willing, about the spiritual presence view that Calvin articulated. And I think Dale is going to defend that particular viewpoint, but I'll let him speak more to that. So the Bread of Life discourse is one of the key passages that Catholics will appeal to for our view of the Eucharist. And funny enough, we're going through the Bread of Life discourse right now in the Sunday lectionary. The next few weeks we'll be covering that. So pay attention, all you Catholics, when the Liturgy of the Word comes up. But in John 6:48-51, Jesus says the following: I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. So notice here that Jesus identifies himself. In fact, he identifies his very flesh as the bread of life, and teaches that feeding upon him is a prerequisite for having eternal life. And he does this after contrasting himself with the bread that came down from heaven in the Old Testament. Because even though the manna was provided by God himself, it did not grant eternal life to those who fed upon it. So the manna is a type of the bread of life, but as Old Testament types go, it is inferior to its antitype. It does not convey the full reality thereof. Now, what happens is that Jesus' Jewish listeners begin to be offended. So in verses 52-56, we read, the Jews then disputed among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? So Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. So you see that once Jesus identifies the bread of life as his own flesh and tells his listeners to feed upon it, that's when they begin to really grumble and become openly hostile. Now, if you pay attention to Bread of Life discourse, up to that point in time, the Jewish listeners were still somewhat open, if skeptical, to his teaching. Like, they were wondering, can this really be the Messiah? And they wanted to see a sign. But once Jesus talks about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, that's when they really don't want to have anything to do with him anymore. Now, if this was all a misunderstanding, Jesus could have corrected them at this point, but he chooses not to do so. It's very interesting because the points when the Jewish people are most hostile to Jesus are not when they misunderstand him, but paradoxically when they understand him correctly. For a good example of that, see John 8, where Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. And the Jews correctly identified that as Jesus claiming divinity for himself. Now, it's also interesting the kind of Greek language that John uses here. Instead of the usual word for to eat, estheo, John uses the more graphic term trogo, which literally means to chew on. That's an unusually graphic verb to use if John intended all of this to be a metaphor, which accompanied by the extended usage of the bread and eating terminology, makes us suspect that something more in mind here than merely a metaphor for faith. In fact, George Beasley Murray, who is a Baptist scholar, and I believe Dale appealed to some of his work in our baptism debate, actually identifies this passage as having relevance to the Eucharist. Beasley Murray, in his commentary on John, writes the following: "Nevertheless, it is evident that neither the evangelist nor the Christian readers could have written or read the saying without conscious reference to the Eucharist, to say the least. They would have acknowledged it as supremely fulfilled in the worship event." So they would have understood this as referring to the Eucharist. Now, I know that some evangelicals object to that, saying, but the Eucharist wasn't even instituted yet at this point. But that is not a barrier to that, because Jesus frequently speaks in terms of things before they happened, such as how he speaks about his being crucified in John 3, long before the crucifixion ever took place. Now, we go to the Last Supper narrative, and for brevity's sake, I only am going to speak on the specific part of the Last Supper narrative that explicitly mentions the body and the blood, and that is in Luke 22, 19 to 20. You'll see variations of this in all four Last Supper narratives, but I chose Luke because he is the most descriptive out of the Synoptic Gospels. And in his account, it says the following: "And he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, 'This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood.'" So there are two things to note here. One is the use of the copula, is, and there is the use of the remembrance language, or in Greek, anamnesis. And if you look at a lot of commentaries on the meaning of the word anamnesis, the majority of them identify this as something more than simply a memory aid. As I mentioned in my previous presentation, if all the Last Supper was a memory aid, it's not a particularly good one, because there are better ways to keep in mind Christ's death and resurrection than breaking some bread and drinking some wine or grape juice, depending on what your church uses. Because if you really wanted to commemorate Jesus, why not have a passion play? Why not have a dramatic reading of the passion narratives? If you really wanted to remember Jesus, those seem like more efficient ways of doing that. Instead, an anamnesis, rather than just merely recalling a past event, actually is a bringing forward of that event in space and time, making it present to believers today. In fact, the Jewish people thought of the Passover as an anamnesis of the Exodus in a weaker sense, in that they are themselves going through the Exodus. So in a way, when the Eucharist is celebrated, it becomes a sacrifice, not in the sense that is a repetition of Christ's passion or a re-sacrificing of Christ, but it is a representation of the one sacrifice of Calvary, which is brought forward to the present day in the Mass. So think of the Mass like a time machine that takes the entire event of Calvary and brings it forward in time. Or, conversely, you could say that it brings us back in time to 2,000 years ago. And in so doing, it makes the benefits of the Passion of the Cross present to us. Now, the second thing has to do with the word is, so the copula in the text. And of course, the simplest way to understand the copula is that it is an identity statement. Jesus is identifying the bread and the wine with his body and blood. Now, a lot of evangelicals will say is could just mean represents. The problem with this is that you're starting to insert other ideas into the text, because if Jesus meant to say that the bread and wine represents his body and blood, why didn't he just say so? And you can't tell me that the language could not have expressed that, because in fact, Koine Greek is perfectly capable of expressing symbolic or representational meanings. Like there is a word, symbolon, that's where we get the word symbol from. And theoretically, if the gospel writers want to convey that the bread and wine were symbols of his body and blood, they could have said something along the lines of tuto estin symbolon to somatos mu, instead of what it actually says, which is tuto estin to somamu. Now, another paradox or another objection that's more directly tied to transubstantiation is this. If the bread and wine are Jesus' own body and blood, doesn't that mean he is essentially holding a bit of himself? Now, D.A. Carson, interestingly, in Exegetical Fallacies, raises the objection. Now, there is a partial misconception here among a lot of evangelicals. The Eucharist is not just a part of Jesus' body, as though he transubstantiated it into his middle finger or his big toe. No, it is his entire self, his body, blood, soul, and divinity. And if Christ's presence is not bound by time and space, sorry, there should be a not there, that's a typo, then this should be easy for him to do. In fact, this is how St. Augustine envisioned the Eucharistic presence at the Last Supper. So in one of his homilies, St. Augustine said the following, and was carried in his own hands. How carried in his own hands? Because when he commended his own body and blood, he took into his hands that which the faithful know, and in a manner carried himself when he said, "This is my body." So we believe that in a way, Christ was indeed carrying himself in his own hands. And because he is God incarnate, he is more than capable of doing so. Now let's get to St. Paul's teaching. And I want to zero in on 1 Corinthians 11, 26 to 30. Now, chapter 10 is also relevant because that's where we get the participation language or the communion language. But I want to focus in on the discernment language that Paul uses here. So Paul writes, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died." So when the ESV uses the word discern, the verb underlying that is diakrino, which means to make a judgment on the basis of careful and detailed information, to judge carefully, to evaluate carefully. So the idea is you're making a judgment call about the thing itself. And in fact, some translations will render that as recognizing. And this would indicate that he regards the supper as the Lord's very body. And this is reinforced by his assertion that those who partake unworthily thus profane the Lord's body. How can you do that if it's only a representation thereof? And this teaching is serious enough that God has put to death those who partake of it unworthily, as we read in verse 30. At this point, some objectors will say, well, Paul's teaching here contradicts the idea of transubstantiation, because even after consecration, the elements are still called bread and wine, whereas according to transubstantiation, they no longer are. Now, it's true that according to transubstantiation, the elements cease to be bread and wine, yet the appearances of bread and wine remain, so they continue to be called by what they appear to us. And this is not unprecedented in Scripture. In Mark 16:5 and Acts 1:10, we see that certain men dressed in white are described in the narrative, and yet we know that even though they are called men, they are not actually human beings. They are angels. They are merely disguised as human beings, and yet Scripture refers to them according to what they appear to our senses. In the same way, Paul can continue to refer to the Eucharistic elements as bread and wine because that is what they appear to our senses. Now, I have 3.5 minutes left, so I want to speak a little bit about the spiritual presence view, which comes from Calvin and the Reformed tradition. And some might say that, well, this is all well and good. You've proven to me that the Zwinglian view is false, but it doesn't rule out a spiritual presence. So yeah, that's still a live option for some evangelicals. Now, certainly, Calvin's view has better explanatory power than Zwingli's. Calvin was a very systematic thinker in that regard. And his view does allow for Christ's flesh and blood to be consumed by believers in a certain, albeit non-corporal sense, as the Westminster Confession would describe it. But it still fails to account for some of the biblical data. Look back at the text that we just read in 1 Corinthians. Paul's language of recognition/discernment would suggest that there is a closer identification of the Eucharistic elements with Christ's body and blood than merely a means towards communicating them. Why would he say that they fail to discern Christ's body and blood if, in fact, what they're discerning is merely a means by which Christ's body and blood are being communicated, and it's actually still bread and wine? Also, if Calvin's view is true, then only true believers, i.e. the elect, actually receive Christ's body and blood at the supper. Yet Paul says those who partake unworthily fail to recognize or discern Christ's body. Yet how could that be the case if they're not receiving Christ's body at all, but just mere bread and wine? And this also creates problems for how we understand Jesus' words at the Last Supper. Because under this view, when Jesus says, "This is my body, which is given up for you," what he really means is, "This communicates my body, which is given up for most of you, except for Judas, who isn't elect." And this way of interpreting the text unnecessarily convolutes the meaning of the words of institution. As I mentioned before, when Jesus says, "This is my body," we should take it at face value and understand it to mean, "This is my body." So in other words, and I'm getting to my conclusion now, the reason why I hold to transubstantiation as opposed to maybe a Calvinist spiritual presence view is because it better makes sense of all the key Eucharistic texts of the New Testament and takes what they say at face value rather than trying to spiritualize them or turn them into representations or metaphors or means of communication, as certain Reformed theologians would put it. So thank you for listening, and that concludes my opening statement.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for that. Now I reset the timer here. 20 minutes opening statement. Dale, whenever you're ready. You're all set on your end?
Yep. Let me just
Okay, and are you going to be sharing your screen?
I am, yeah. If I can get my mouse.
Yeah, go ahead and do that before I start the timer.
Yeah, I really need to get a new mouse. This thing is
no worries.
Come on. Oh my God.
Love the background there with the Jerusalem.
Yeah. I took that's from a trip. I actually took that shot back in 2013. So
when was that?
Back in 2013. Is my mouse actually dead?
I was there a few months ago. Very intense time.
Yeah, I can imagine. With all when I went, it was pretty peaceful, and so Come on, just move over. Okay, so it is moving. I'm at the just 10. This is horrible. Sorry, I'm so sorry about this.
No worries.
Imagine if I won the debate because of technical difficulties.
Oh man.
All right.
Well, that would just prove that, in some cases, it could be that just presentations win out rather than the truth, even though I agree with your side as being on the truth. But certainly some people see it that way. It's kind of like there's some debaters who are really good at debating and they defend a proposition that's false, but they appear to win just because they do so well.
I think I'm finally. All right. I finally.
All right. You all set?
Yep.
Okay.
Come on, Max. All right. I'm ready. Sorry about that.
No worries. Okay. So 3, 2, 1. All right.
All right. So the Great Lord's Supper debate. So sorry to shock the fans, but as Lewis kind of mentioned, guess what? The debate's over. So one thing that annoys me, it's kind of a pet peeve with debates, especially with atheists and stuff who go for the lack theism debate, is when both sides don't take up the burden of proof and try to make a positive claim of their own, where they have to prove it. Now, I have to, just out of respect and fairness to Lewis, I do want to admit he is in a bit of an unfair situation, because during my research for this debate, I was supposed to defend the memorialist position. But during my research, it became apparent to me that I couldn't meet my burden of proof. I'm not sure whether it's a memorialist view or maybe it's a spiritual presence view. So I do want to admit that up front. But that said, there's still a debate, so don't go away. Because what we agreed to debate is the Roman Catholic hypothesis true? Lewis is arguing the affirmative, the transubstantiation view. And on that front, I am pretty sure I can prove that the Roman Catholic view, transubstantiation, is probably false. So what is the Roman Catholic hypothesis? As Lewis mentioned, there are those three elements. There's an element of thanksgiving to God. Great, no issue there as a Protestant. There is this issue of a memorial or anamnesis, right? So it's a making present. Now that is going to be controversial. Lewis kind of compares it. He's giving this timelessness or a time travel, right? So effectively, the bread and wine are essentially the DeLoreans, and they create a time portal whereby we can travel back to Calvary or back to the Lord's Supper and make that event present. And no need to travel at 88 miles per hour to do that. And then thirdly, there's also the Eucharist involves the real presence. But as Lewis said, because I'm open to the spiritual presence view, that's no longer the key issue. Is that presence in the mode of transubstantiation? Are the bread and wine literally substantively changed from one substance into the other while retaining the accidental properties of bread and wine? So that's what the Roman Catholic thing is that we're debating. Once again, my methodology will be the same. Plausibility, explanatory scope, how many facts does it deal with? Explanatory power, how well qualitatively does the hypothesis explain the relevant biblical facts? My criterion of being less ad hoc or not having the least amount of non-evidenced assumptions. And then the bonus criterion of illumination. How many non-relevant facts outside of the New Testament does it explain? And that sort of thing. Now, I didn't hear Lewis in his presentation. I'm assuming he's still applying the three principles he did yesterday, but maybe he's not. Okay, so there are three texts. So we'll start with the bread of life in John chapter 6. And this is, so Jesus is teaching, and he says, look, that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. And of course, the Jews at the time freak out. You cannibal freak. We can't believe in this. How the heck can we eat your flesh? What are you talking about? And as Lewis points out, what does Jesus do? He doesn't say, "Oh, you fools! That was just being metaphorical. I was just being symbolic." No, Jesus doubles down and says, "Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life." So that seems very clear cut, right? Well, hang on a second, right? So in the first place, there is no explicit or implicit reference to Thanksgiving or to a memorial. And that makes sense because, Lewis is right. This is a forward-looking text. Forward-looking, I believe, to the Eucharist. So I will agree with the Roman Catholic up to that point. But I don't think we can rule out the metaphorical or symbolic view of this text at all. So my first argument is, so Lewis says, but Jesus doubles down, doesn't he? And my argument is, yeah, so what? That doesn't prove that he's being literal in any way. No, this is Jesus's modus operandi. This is God throughout the entirety of the Bible. He never likes to correct unbelievers in their misunderstandings of what he's saying, right? I mean, there are countless texts, such as parables, where Jesus says, though seeing, they do not see, though hearing, they do not hear or understand. He constantly tells his disciples, don't keep it a secret. Don't tell them who I am or what I said or what I did here. In Mark, it's an entire thing. So Jesus constantly, and the John text here actually explicitly says this, that he is testing. Are you guys real seekers or not? And he could discern that these guys were fakes. They weren't interested in the truth. So he gave them a dose of harsh reality that he knew they wouldn't be able to handle. And because of that, they went away. Whereas other people, the true seekers, will stick around and say, man, I don't get that. Let me probe you, Jesus. What are you talking about? Just like Nicodemus did when he was confused about being born again. So this is Jesus's MO. Of course he didn't clarify. A second argument, no, I was told by every Protestant scholar this is an unsophisticated argument. Don't bring it up. But since I'm not interested in winning a debate or looking scholarly or something like that, this is admittedly an issue that I struggle with. So I would like an answer. This is literally cannibalism. Under transubstantiation, you are eating human flesh and human blood because it's Jesus's human nature that is present. So yeah, that sounds to me like cannibalism. So yeah, maybe it's unsophisticated. I'd love to hear Lewis's response to that, and if it is a bad argument, I will give it up. The next argument is that, look, it's clearly talking about either metaphorical or it's a spiritual interpretation. And John chapter 6, verses 60 to 66 actually clarifies that for us. It says in verse 63, it is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak to you are spirit, and they are life. And on this front, I just want to quote biblical scholar Dr. Craig Keener. So he kind of says, if I can bring up the page here, let me see. Okay, so he says, it is not the literal flesh that brings life, but the Spirit, a point also underlined in John chapter 3, verse 6. The Spirit thus joins the Father and Son in giving life. One may also note that flesh cannot comprehend divine truth adequately elsewhere in the Jesus tradition as well. This comprehension requires a revelation from the Father. So a merely human fleshly perspective on Jesus and his words is inadequate here. So thus the disciples must imbibe his spirit, not his literal flesh. His life is also present in the words. Remember that word, that key thing there, right? So hang on, shoot. Okay, it is Jesus's message, his words, rather than his literal flesh, that communicates the life he has been promising through the heavenly bread. It is those who come and believe whose hunger and thirst will be quenched. So I just totally disagree with Lewis's interpretation of this verse. And Craig Keener, also, who knows the Greek, also agrees with me on that. A fourth objection is that if Lewis, the Roman Catholic view, is correct, it involves an implausible atonement theory, right? Because look, what is the penalty? The wages of sin is what? Flesh and blood? No, the wages of sin is death. So death is literally the consequence or the punishment for our sins, either both physical and or spiritual. And biblically, that's defined as a separation. So physical death is a separation of soul from body. Spiritual death is a relational separation from God and a person's soul, right? That's what hell is, I believe. It's not literally blood and flesh. That can't atone for anything. A lump of flesh and a cup of blood does nothing in and of itself. Instead, blood itself is symbolic in the Old Testament. It represents, because life is in the blood, it represents, the shedding of it represents death. So I just wanted to raise that issue. And then, of course, Jesus uses lots of metaphors and stuff like that, including ones about spiritual food and spiritual drinking. And that's not unique to Jesus. Even extra biblical Jewish writings like Sirach 24 says things like, those who eat of me will hunger for more, and those who drink of me will thirst for more. This guy isn't trying to speak literally here. Now, Lewis brings up, last point on John 6, Lewis brings up this Greek word. I had it down as trogon, but that's not how Lewis pronounced it. So But he says it's this graphic word meaning to chew, or as someone in the chat rightly said, to gnaw on, to literally gnaw on. Now, is this true? Well, when I actually looked up the Greek here, even though it's not my expertise, and according to a scholar, Matthew Taylor, the Greek word to chew had become synonymous with the ordinary word to eat, which is estheo, by the time the Gospel of John was written. Originally, trogo was used of animals and conveyed of chewing and mastication and that sort of thing, but over time, the word had gradually begun to be replaced by the more common to eat. Beyond that, why would he switch the verb in that? So at first he says to eat, then all of a sudden he uses this word to gnaw on, to chew. Well, stylistic variance was the common, right? In order to make a mundane speech, people would engage in stylistic variance. This was common among ancient Jewish rabbis and speakers and that sort of thing. So that's why he switches it up. And don't forget, Roman Catholics, if you're going to make too much of this verb, well, then you're kind of messed up in the Lord's Supper, because he uses the verb estheo, to eat, not this trogon verb. So, all right. So in terms of the Last Supper, very quickly, so the key here is, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance for me. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. And Lewis makes mention of this is as being very important. It's got to be taken literally. It doesn't make sense, or it's ad hoc to say, well, it is in a different sense to represent. So the first thing I want to say is, so this isn't true. As my friend Phil Baer mentions, that the word is, it has multiple different senses. I think it was Hillary Clinton who said, it depends what you mean by the word is. And, there are different senses of how that word can operate in language. And that's the same in Greek, ancient Greek, or English. It's not always, the default is not to treat the word is as an identity statement. And that's what Lewis is trying to do. Now, think of the problem with that. If you do that, then me and Lewis, we should all go home. The Trinity is false, because it says God is, the Father is God. The Holy Spirit is God. Jesus is God. If those are identity statements, well, then Muslims are right. The logical problem of the Trinity takes effect. It's a contradictory doctrine. But no, we know that is not functioning as a literal identity statement there. So that's my first objection there. He didn't mention the greater. Okay, so another thing with the Last Supper is, here's a key thing. Human beings are spatial beings, okay? Jesus, in all of the Last Supper narratives, to my knowledge, is a spatio-temporal being. He has spatial dimensions. He is bound by space and time at the moment, as described in the text itself, right? The bread and the water are fully physical things that exist, and stuff like that. They're within space and time. So they can't be the same thing. Now, Lewis has a loophole that's very interesting, right? So you appeal, well, don't forget, Jesus and God by extension are timeless, right? So, okay, so maybe he's timelessly present there as well. So let's just think about this. So if Lewis is correct, Jesus is there's one Jesus that's spatial and temporal that's there. There's also this who's not even mentioned in the text, a spaceless and timeless Jesus who's present in substance there as well. And there's the accidental properties in the form of bread and wine. So there are all three of these things supposedly in this text, even though the spaceless, timeless Jesus isn't mentioned. This is extremely ad hoc. It is off the charts ad hoc. Further, it's implausible, because once you go temporal, you can never go back. Jesus is explicitly described as being temporal. He has temporal location and temporal extension at the Lord's Supper. Once you go temporal, you can't go back to being timeless. It's not like when Jesus ascended into heaven, he became timeless again. You can't do that. You can't lose temporal properties like that. So this is just implausible, Lewis's solution here. Furthermore, in terms of substances, so the transubstantiation says there's a change in substance. Okay, great. Well, what is a substance? Well, in the Latin, right, it means to stand under and bear up your properties. Essentially, you are a thing that has the highest degree of unity, that you exist. What does exist mean? Well, it's a relationship. when a thing, like a substance, is in a relationship whereby it exemplifies certain properties, such as the essential properties for the kind of thing that it is. That's what it means to exist. So there has to be a substance, right? So what is the human substance? What is that? I think the nature of a human being is that the essential properties is that it's a thing that exemplifies all of the essential human making properties. What is that? Well, it's a person, a soul that has all the faculties for personhood, that is embodied in a physical body governed by the human genome. Now, the problem here is that the bread doesn't exemplify a human genome. It will have the bread and wine genome. So it can't be true. There is no changing of the substances, swapping of essential properties for one another. Here's just kind of a difference between that. Moving on. So 1 Corinthians. So I think this is the strongest text that we have. It's a post-ascension text and that sort of thing. But look, even if I grant Lewis's interpretation of this verse, at best it proves that there's a real presence, which I think is consistent with a spiritual presence, or could be even consistent with consubstantiation. It doesn't entail transubstantiation, and that is the topic of today's debate. Furthermore, the Lord's Supper was not just about Christ's act of redemption. It was about the people whom he has redeemed. So this is speaking about, remember that point about discerning the body? And Lewis takes that very literally. Like you got to discern this thing is the literal flesh, or else you're condemned to hell, literally. But I don't think that's what I go with Dr. Craig Keener's interpretation, where what is the discernment of this body, right? Remember, Paul is saying, like, there's division in the Church of Corinth. You've got to examine yourself. And I agree with how Lewis translated that from the Greek. It's this self-examination to see, have I wronged my brother? Do I have to put the thing aside, go apologize and repent, and then come back first? So discerning the body, that is the body of Christ. That's the church, discerning that you're supposed to be unified as one body of Christ. It's not talking about discerning the body in the bread itself. That's how I think makes most sense of that text. I do, in terms of it being a re-presenting or re-sacrifice, so I do think that it is a re-sacrifice, and I'll give something, but I'm not going to argue that. I'm going to be no strawmans tonight, as charitable as I can. I'm just going to assume Lewis is correct, that it's not a re-sacrifice. It's a representing or a making present.
2-minute warning.
Okay. So that brings up various problems. Making present, right? So I think we can prove that the A theory of time, the tensed theory of time, is true. And that means it's metaphysically impossible to make the past present or make the future present. Time travel is literally impossible. There is no space-time continuum or anything like that. And I believe I can prove that. But in the text itself, look, there are two things. We're doing it in remembrance, past tense. And what are we doing? We're anticipating until he comes, future tense. So even this text in 1 Corinthians is giving the tensed theory of time, which makes Lewis's time travel explanation metaphysically impossible or implausible. So in conclusion, plausibility, I think there are several elements that are implausible there. I do think the Roman Catholic thing has good explanatory scope. It explains all the texts. It lacks explanatory power because it's reading and forcing transubstantiation into, at best, real presence texts. And there is ample ambiguity there with respect to tensed facts being represented in what Lewis would describe as a timeless event, or at the very least a tenseless event. And it also employs non-evidenced assumptions about God's timelessness. So thank you very much. That's my statement there.
Thank you for that. Okay, so now we're going to go to the next phase where we have 2 10-minute rebuttals each. Let me start the timer over here.
Give me a second while I put up time on my end. Sure. And also, I am going to pull up my verbum. So
I'm just going to stay in my slides just because it'll probably take forever to get back to it for my rebuttal. But
Fair
yeah.
enough.
Yeah.
Okay. So once it's up, I can start.
All right. 3, 2, 1.
Yeah. First of all, I want to give Dale credit for giving a much more sophisticated critique of transubstantiation than a lot of the more simplistic arguments that we often hear from other Protestants. Now, I'm going to try as best as I can to respond to each of the arguments that he presented in roughly the order they were presented. I'm not going to be able to get through all of them, but I'll see how many I can do. So let's start off with the question. Is Jesus not out to correct the unbeliever? So one of his counter arguments is that Jesus is not concerned with making sure that his audience understands him correctly. So now you can kind of argue that maybe for the unbelievers, but that doesn't explain why he doesn't correct the misunderstanding of his own disciples. Because as you can see towards the end, he explains himself to nobody, not even his own disciples. And this creates problems for his appeal to Matthew 13. So I'm going to go up to Matthew 13 now. So he appeals to verses 10 to 17, where it mentions the fact that Jesus will often speak in terms of parables in order to, in a way, conceal his true message from those who are not open to it. The problem with this is this assumes that what Jesus is doing in John 6 is giving a parable, which is kind of controversial in and of itself. But also, look at what Jesus does immediately after making that statement. He actually goes on to explain the parable that he had just given, which in this case is the parable of the sower. So he actually makes sure that his own disciples understand what he was getting at here. So we don't see a parallel example of that in John 6. If, in fact, Jesus' goal was to, conceal his real meaning, he would have revealed it at the very least to his inner circle. Now, also, one thing that I mentioned before, and I didn't hear Dale interact with this yet, maybe he will. The unbelieving Jews are most offended by Jesus not when they misunderstand him, but when they understand him correctly. And the greatest example of that are the places where Jesus claims divinity for himself, such as in John 8:58, where he says, "Before Abraham was, I am." Or in Mark chapter 14, where the high priest asks, "Are you the Christ, Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus says, "I am, and you'll see the Son of Man come in the clouds of heaven," etc., etc. So it would seem that if the unbelieving Jews are offended by Jesus, they're most offended by him when they get the point. Now, it is true that they are seeking him for false reasons, but but so many people become Christians that way, and that's not necessarily a reason to accuse them of unbelief. Whereas in John chapter 6, we see that, again, the Jewish crowds, they are still somewhat open, even if they are skeptical. It's only when when Jesus begins identifying himself as the flesh that they become outright hostile. Now, as for the cannibalism argument, it's funny that Dale brings this up, because if you look at early church history, you know who else made the cannibalism argument? The ancient pagans, which they gave towards early Christians. So whenever this argument comes up against Catholics by Protestants, I like to think we're in good company, because that's the same thing that the early Christians were accused of. In fact, I would almost say that is your view even in line with what the early church believed, unless the cannibalism argument was being thrown at you? So kind of putting it on its head. Now, to answer the charge, it should be borne in mind that what we receive at the Eucharist is not just Christ's bare flesh, but in fact, it is his whole person, body, blood, soul, and divinity. Furthermore, he is not consumed as bare flesh. He is consumed under the species of bread and wine, which is a very different thing from hacking off a bit of human flesh from a dead person and eating it. And as for eating Christ Christ's body and blood, I would like to remind everyone that Christ is our Passover lamb. Paul makes that connection in 1 Corinthians, and the Eucharist is the antitype of the Passover. Now, what does one do with the Passover lamb during the Passover? Eat it, of course. So that creates that symmetry between the Old Testament type and the New Testament antitype. And to say that the eating is only metaphorical for faith kind of ruins the typology between the Passover and the Eucharist. Now, there's this question about whether Jesus' body is spatio-temporal. Now, I'm going to use a big Latin phrase. It's called the communicatio idiomatum. Now, this is something that both Catholics and Protestants believe, but we disagree on to what extent we apply the idea. But the communicatio idiomatum basically states that Jesus' divinity in some way communicates its attributes to his humanity. So the union of the two natures in effect causes the humanity to begin to take on some of the features of the divine nature. Unless you think I'm just making stuff up, just think about Jesus' post-resurrection appearances, because if you think about it, Jesus' body after his resurrection displays some rather unusual properties. So in John 20, he enters into a locked room. How did he get there? Or in a couple of different places, he appears to his disciples, such as in the road to Emmaus and to Mary Magdalene, but in a form that they didn't recognize. It would seem that there's something going on with Jesus' body that is greater than what you would expect with an ordinary human body. Also, think about some of the other resurrection appearances. It seems that Jesus could just appear at will to people. So he appears to Paul in Acts chapter 9. But how can he do that when his body is up in heaven? It would seem that in his resurrected, glorified state, Jesus' body is not bounded by space and time the same way we are. Okay, 3 minutes. Let's see how much I can get to. Now, 1 Corinthians... now the question is, okay, is this text compatible with other real presence views? So we don't have a Lutheran in the audience or in this debate, so I would be interested to have this discussion with a Lutheran. I will admit that I can sort of see an argument for the Lutheran view in 1 Corinthians 11. I haven't spent enough time delving into how that would be refuted. The Calvinist view, the spiritual presence view, is a little bit harder for me because it's hard to see how you can understand the idea of discerning or recognizing the body in terms of communicating the body through the elements. And Dale has... thank you. And Dale has a very interesting postulate, which is that in 1 Corinthians 11:29, when it says judging the body, it's actually referring to the body of Christ, i.e. the church, rather than the bread and the wine as the body and blood. And yet, that would create some problems because the closest referent to body would be in the preceding verses references to Christ's body and blood in the Eucharist. We see this in verse 27 and verse 24. So did Paul just suddenly change topics in verse 29? I find that hard to believe. It would make more sense to think that verse 29 is a continuation of his argument regarding the body and blood of Christ that began in verse 23. And you could argue goes even further back to chapter 10. Now, one remaining minute, I want to say a little bit about this the idea that representation contradicts certain theories of time. I don't know if we have time to get to different theories of time in this debate. And admittedly, I know a little bit about A versus B theory of time, but not in great detail. But it does strike me as odd that Dale wants to hang his objection to the representation language on the basis of a specific theory of time, which not even all physicists and philosophers of time agree upon. So maybe you'd first have to prove that that particular theory of time is true, but that would take us way too far afield. But also, even if that was true, just remember that God, being timeless, is perfectly capable of taking an event that has already happened and making it real once again in the present day, even if it is already past. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to restart the timer here. Dale, you have 10 minutes to offer your rebuttal. Um, you all set on your end?
Yep.
Okay.
I put up my slides, so I'm good to go.
Okay. 3, 2, 1.
Okay, my rebuttal that I've prepared here was to Lewis's original presentation. So I'm going to try to go through this quickly and then address what his real rebuttal was. So real case was. So Lewis provides these three principles, or at least he did. I gave the same kind of thing. The principle of simplicity that he uses, I think, is less objective than mine. I think employing non-evidenced assumptions is a more objective way to do that. In terms of the principle of normativity, I don't think that really applies to this debate, because all of us, we're agreeing that the three New Testament relevant texts, they're not exceptions to the rule. They are normative for understanding the Eucharist. So I don't think this one is relevant. Okay, so then there's the principle of history. So I don't think Lewis kind of got into it too much, kind of thing. But so I'll just say a couple points. So first, so if you do appeal to history, a simple appeal to what the church fathers said in history alone is insufficient. You need to establish that what the church fathers are saying is in fact reliable in terms of truth, or we have a reason to think that it's probably true. Secondly, unlike baptismal regeneration, there isn't a universal consensus, not even in appearance here. There is a bunch of controversies throughout church history, including the early church, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and Lewis did mention Augustine. Interestingly, Augustine disagreed with the doctrine of transubstantiation, according to my understanding. And then thirdly, these texts are ambiguous, and thus they lack explanatory power with respect to the Roman Catholic hypothesis. So with that said, I'm not going to get into the history because I don't think Lewis got into that. So let me address what Lewis actually did bring up then. Okay, so I'll get out of my slides if I can. Actually, I won't waste time. So Jesus doesn't correct the unbelievers. Well, that's not true. He does in John chapter 6, verses 60 to 63. That was my argument, is that he is taking the disciples aside, just like he does with the confusing parables. And then he's explaining, look, it's not the flesh that saves, it's the spirit. It's my words and understanding that it is actually going to save you. And I quoted Dr. Craig Keener, his scholarship on that front, kind of thing. So it is analogous to the parables in Matthew 13, I would say. And then Lewis says offended. He makes the point that, well, look, they got offended, right? And they usually only get offended when they understand Jesus correctly. So I have to admit, I haven't taken an inductive survey of when the unbelieving Jews get offended or not. So I don't know if there's a general trend in that, but I do think that it's a little bit, you're reading a little bit too much into it there. If you're saying, well, this establishes that the only time the Jews would get offended is when they're understanding Jesus correctly. Now that said, are they understanding Jesus correctly here or not? I don't think they are. And that's why I quoted that Craig Keener explanation in John chapter 6, verses 60 to 65. Now, Lewis says that pagan, in terms of the cannibalism thing, so I will take the criticism and the bashing. Yes, I am like a pagan. The ignorant pagans claimed that they were cannibalists, and this is clearly not true. But why isn't it true? I would say it is actually true on transubstantiation, but it's not under the Protestant view. If it's just symbolic or if it's a spiritual presence, we would say the pagans didn't understand what the Christians were saying there. Now, it is interesting. Lewis says that it's not just the body and the blood. According to Catholic doctrine, it's the soul, the divinity, and stuff like that that's present as well. And I did encounter that. So I don't know what to make of that. I need to look further into that to see if that's problematic. Just offhand, I would say that Jesus was a person. He didn't have a soul, because I take a Trinity monotheism view, but that's outside of this debate. So the Passover typology, yeah. So he brings up the typology. Well, it would be wrong if they're not literally eating Jesus. Well, in the Passover, they're literally eating the Passover lamb and stuff like that. But again, as even Lewis mentions, typologies work. How do they work? By highlighting one or more similarities. So it doesn't have to be, that they're eating the lamb, because there is no lamb meat in the Eucharist, right? It's bread and wine. So I think what's going on here, the similarity that connects this typology, is that Jesus he's there through the shedding of his blood and stuff like that, and remembering that, his body and blood being beaten and shed on the cross. That's how we're passed over in terms of being judged for our sins. That's what connects the typology there, not a literal eating of the lamb. So this is very problematic and interesting. So he mentions that, look, through the death and resurrection and through this thing, the human nature of Jesus acquires certain properties of Jesus. They're communicated to Jesus. I'm assuming things like omnipresence, obviously immateriality stuff. Again, the only property I think you're talking about is omnipresent, but that's an incommunicable property. You can't communicate that to human flesh in any way. Human beings can't be omnipresent, and that just depends on how you define it, right? I think it means omnipresent means you're causally effective at every spatial location, and you are knowledgeable of the facts of every special location. That's what omnipresent means to me. And Jesus, that's incommunicable to a human nature. Others, okay, so 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 29. What does he say here? Judging the body. Yeah, so he takes issue with my body of Christ interpretation for the body, for discerning the body. And this comes from the famous biblical scholar, Dr. Craig Keener. So this isn't my brilliant idea. So it is credible from someone who knows the Greek. But it is in context, because Lewis says it's out of context. Well, no, it's not, because in context, we're talking about divisions within the church. What is the purpose for self-examination? To see if you've wronged your brother or sister in the body of Christ, in the church. And if you have to go and apologize and repent and make amends with them first, and then you come back to the Lord's Supper. And remember, Corinth was involved in various issues with the Lord's Supper, right? Of division in the body. Oh, I'm of this status. I'm better than you because I'm rich. You're just some poor little peasant. And Paul, the whole point of this is Paul saying, no, you're one body. You take part together. That's what the church is. So the church as the body of Christ is mentioned, and I would say the central focus, not discerning the literal body of Christ as the bread. I mean, if that's the case, then where's the blood and the wine? That's not even mentioned. So I think my interpretation is more plausible there. In terms of the A theory of time, so Lewis has said that's outside the scope. I will say that this is key for me, because I do believe I can prove the A theory of time, and even among the physicists. So I've had William Lane Craig or Dr. Ryan Mullins on my show. So I think I can establish it, but without going outside the scope of this debate. Remember, my proof was the text of John itself, which uses tensed, the A theory of time, tensed language, remembering Jesus, past tense, and looking forward till he comes, future tense. So I think the Lord's Supper narratives and 1 Corinthians here use tensed language, and therefore assume the A theory of time is true. So that's my rebuttal.
All right, you had a little bit of time left, about a minute, but if you want, we can go ahead and move to the next round.
Okay. Louis, I'll just ask you, is there anything that I missed? Or I guess we can do it in discussion.
We can do it in the open discussion if you like.
Sure.
Okay, well, let's move over to that section.
Okay.
Let me adjust the clock here to reflect 40 minutes of open discussion like we had last time. And y'all could just take it whatever direction you want to go. Let me know when both of you are ready for me to begin the timer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All set?
Yep.
Right.
Okay.
Sure.
3, 2, 1. All right, dive in.
Okay, so actually, there are a few items that I missed in my rebuttal that I did want to address. So maybe we can, Lord willing, cover some of those.
Absolutely.
So first of all, I want to get a better understanding of what you understand John 6 to be about. So when you read that Jesus says, "Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood," what do you think he actually means when he says that?
Yeah. So with John 6, all right. Oh, shoot. Okay. I'm not going to be able to bring it up to remind myself now. Okay. So I can't.
You want me to pull up the text for you?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just,
Michael, if you can do the share screen for me. So, yeah, there you go. Now it should be visible to both of us. So if you like, you can highlight whichever verses you want to highlight and then tell me, what your exegesis is of those particular passages. Because I'm curious to know, what do you think Jesus actually is trying to get at when he says, "Eat my flesh and drink my blood"?
yeah. So I think so. As I said in this debate, I don't know yet. I can't make the argument whether it's either a symbolic or metaphorical statement, which is what I argued for a little bit, or maybe it refers to the spiritual presence or something like that, some kind of non-physical, non-literal presence. But yeah, I think I would favor the metaphorical view.
Yeah. But even under a spiritual presence view, you could say that in some way Jesus is in fact commanding believers to eat his flesh and drink his blood, correct?
Say that again. Sorry. Let me just...
If you were to take, say, Calvin's view, Calvin and the Reformed tradition says that in some way you are in fact eating Jesus' flesh and drinking his blood during the Eucharist. It's just happening in a non-corporeal way. So perhaps if you were to take the spiritual presence view, you could argue that there is still that concrete connection between this text and the Eucharist.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you're absolutely correct, right? Because from my understanding, the spiritual presence view of John Calvin is that Jesus is spiritually present in a special way. I have no doubt about that. Even under the memorial view, I would argue that, but it's just spiritually present in the bread and wine, or wine, grape juice, or whatever it is, or is he just specially present in general, kind of thing? And I don't know what the answer is. Like I said, I kind of realized I need to do more research to figure it out. Okay. But here's what I would say is John chapter 6 verses 60 and afterwards, they do make it clear. They do clarify that Jesus is talking at the very least spiritually here, right? So if I could see that.
Yeah, I pull it up for you.
Okay.
So I believe you're focusing on this verse right here.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's the Spirit who gives life. And remember, he's focusing, according to Craig Keener, they're focusing on the message, the words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. And that's why believing and coming to Jesus is representing the bread and wine where you will never thirst again. It's not talking about literally eating flesh.
Yeah. Let's see, here's the trouble that I have with that, because it almost makes it sound like Jesus goes on this whole spiel about the importance of his flesh and blood. And then in verse 63, he's basically saying, psych, I'm just speaking metaphorically, guys. But, that would mean that, he made this whole spiel for, how do I say this? He could have used better language if that was what he was trying to convey, rather than trying to create this whole extended metaphor. Plus, it also assumes that when it says the flesh is no help at all, he's referring to his own flesh. which, we know that flesh can mean multiple things. So it doesn't necessarily mean Christ's flesh is no help at all.
Yeah. So I agree that it could not mean that, but I think in context it does seem to be addressing their misunderstanding, right? That they misunderstood Jesus talking about his literal flesh. That's why they were offended. The other people, the unbelievers, I guess, as it were, and even the disciples themselves. This is why this is difficult. This is a hard saying. Who can understand it? Now, in terms of your main point about, well, it seems like Jesus, he kind of sucks as a communicator, right? Like, why would he say it the wrong way and then fix it with his disciples? Well, that's my point. That's what I'm saying is his modus operandi, because his point there is not to communicate the truths clearly. It's to test who's the real seeker, who really cares about God's truth. Just like when he's teaching parables, right? I mean, you could say, well, Jesus sucks. Why is he using parables? And then he explains to the disciples after the fact, like, no, that you're missing the point. He's trying to test who's really seeking the truth, who's willing to stick around beyond just the superficial offenses and probe deeper.
Now, here's another issue that I have with that. Okay, so let's say verse 63, is Jesus correcting some misunderstanding that the Jews have. Well, then verse 66, it says, and after this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. So why is it that 3 verses after he's corrected them, they still walk away? You would think that if what Jesus is doing here is saying, I was just speaking metaphorically, the disciples would have been like, oh, we get, oh, okay. Then, we were just getting into a huff and puff for no real reason. But instead, this is what they do.
So that's a really good question. So I'm not sure why the ones that stuck behind. I think in context, it's saying, and I remember reading somewhere else in this text, John 60, it's saying, again, they stuck behind. They wanted to give it one last chance. Like, are you really saying that this cannibalism thing or something like that? And when he explained it, I guess they're just like, it wasn't good enough for them. That's a good question. I don't know why, once he explained to them about the Spirit, but you have the same issue on if we interpret it under the Roman Catholic thing. I mean, okay, explaining to them, okay, here's the real deal, guys. It's the Spirit who gives life. The flesh is no help at all, or something like that. Why would that offend them?
Well, Jesus is, under the Catholic view, according to verse 63, Jesus is explaining the source of their unbelief. The saying, the flesh is no help at all, what he means is the flesh cannot help you to grasp these things, because the words I've spoken to you are spirit and life. And remember, I just clarified before that spirit and life doesn't mean metaphorical. So the disciples turn back and no longer walk with them because they are fleshly minded, to use Paul's language in Romans 8. So Jesus is forecasting the source of their unbelief, if that makes sense.
Okay, well, let me ask this. So, like, what would you make then of Craig Keener's argument where he's talking about, look, it's about understanding divine revelation kind of thing, and the words that Jesus is speaking. The message is what is the Spirit. That's what's saving you, and how you respond. You come and believe. That determine, and I could look up where those verses are if you need, but that's what's determining it. It's not at all about this understanding that, oh yeah, it's real literal flesh or something like that.
Well, I would affirm it in part because the Spirit does play a role in revealing these things and also enabling us to understand them. But remember, the Spirit operates in many more ways than just that. Although I think it'll be very hard to get into further depth into that without bringing back our previous debate about the role of the Spirit and the water in John 3. But the point is that the Spirit does work in people through different ways. So yes, illumination, revelation, that's one way. But in the context, and in fact, I would say that according to my understanding, that is what the Spirit is supposed to do, according to verse 63. The Spirit is the one who gives life in the sense of enabling someone to receive what Jesus has said. But that doesn't contradict the Eucharistic understanding of this passage. In fact, it complements it, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. I'll need to think about that.
Now, I do have there was one point that I wanted to address in my rebuttal, but due to lack of time, it didn't make the cut, and has to do with the word trogo in 52. So you said that the problem is, well, Jesus uses estheo in the Last Supper narratives, and that kind of undercuts the use of trogo here. Now, it's interesting because in Greek, different words can have different so this is getting into lexical semantics, which is more my area of expertise. So different words can be roughly synonymous in that their ranges of meaning can overlap. So in a sense, estheo and trogo, their ranges of meaning overlap.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
But they're not complete synonyms in that you can use them interchangeably in any given circumstance. So what I would argue is that trogo is much more restricted than estheo. So in every place where trogo occurs, you could theoretically replace it with estheo, but you can't do the reverse. You can't replace any old reference to trogo with estheo. And to show you this, I want to pull up Lo Enida's Greek lexicon. So if you look on the right-hand side of the screen now, trogo gets used a few times in the Greek New Testament. It's used in Matthew 24:38. It's used in Acts 10:10. It's used in John 6:13, and it's used in 1 Corinthians 8:4. Now, interestingly, one thing that you'll notice all of these instances have in common is they refer to literal eating and drinking. So there is no instance anywhere in Scripture that I can find, unless John 6 is the exception, but you have to prove that, where trogo is being used in a metaphorical sense. So in other words, my argument would be that, well, you can use estheo in both a literal and a metaphorical sense, but trogo, as far as I can tell, only ever gets used in a literal sense.
Okay, so what do you make of because I cited the scholar who was saying that what you're saying, it wasn't true, that they could be used synonymously. So I guess they do fully overlap at the time John wrote his gospel.
I don't know of any two words in Greek that fully overlap. There's almost always a slight difference in the lexical range of two words. Out of curiosity, which commentary are you referring to?
So it was from Matthew Taylor who said that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know too much about his argument. What I would say is, if you want to make the case for a non-literal use of the verb trogo, you would have to show me an instance of a non-literal use of the word trogo.
Okay. I don't have it off the top of my head, kind of thing. But maybe it's in the article where he gives this.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see that then. Actually, on that note, you mentioned a passage from Sirach. I believe it's Sirach chapter 24, yes. verse 19. Now here is very interesting because, once again, I have the Septuagint text here. Apologies for most of the audience that cannot read Greek. So come to me who desire me and eat your fill of the produce. Interestingly, the word eat your fill is all one word in Greek, and it is the word empimplemi. So in Greek, it literally means to have your fill or to be satisfied with. So I don't think this works as a parallel because it doesn't use trogo. It doesn't even use estheo. It uses empimplemi, which is a completely different word, which has a completely different range of meaning. So I would take issue with using this as a counter argument.
Okay. Yeah, because I think my main point in raising that was just to show, like, look, these metaphors of eating and drinking someone are prevalent and known in the Jewish times. But I guess what your point with the Greek words, which let's face it, I can't respond to it, kind of thing. But you're saying the word eat eat and eat your fill can be used either literally or metaphorically, whereas this trogos or whatever it is can't be. No. Well, what about, you said that they do overlap to some degree. So like what?
I'll try to illustrate the point using English. Okay, so let's use the word shirt. Okay, now there are different types of shirts. Okay, so for example, just pulling something off my hanger, I have here a barong, which is a traditional Filipino dress shirt. Now you could say that this is roughly synonymous with the word shirt because it is a type of shirt, and every barong is in fact a shirt, but not every shirt is a barong. So in the same way, every instance of trogo is synonymous with estheo in the sense that it is an act that involves estheo, but not every instance of estheo is an act that involves trogo. So it's more restricted in that sense. Kind of like if you imagine the ranges of meaning, trogo is like a smaller circle embedded within a larger circle.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Cool. Like I said, that makes sense what you're saying. I don't know who's right, you or Matthew Taylor kind of thing. So I would need to look that up. I tend to believe your Greek scholarship. So if you say it doesn't work, then fair enough.
Yeah, I will say this. If someone can really show me an instance where trogo is used in a metaphorical sense in broader Greek literature, then that could undermine my point. I just need to see where that happens.
Okay, so let me ask you then. So going to the Last Supper narratives then. So but leaving the timeless part out of it for the sake of for this first part. It's a two-part question. Okay, so for the first part, let's leave the timelessness element out of it. Would you agree that that this verse wouldn't make sense then, because Jesus is in fact spatial and temporal, right? He has a temporal location. He's at 30 AD or whatever, and he has temporal extension, right? He's extended throughout the Last Supper temporally, and he's got spatial location and spatial extension, which doesn't include the bread or the wine. Those are spatially separate from him. Right.
Yeah. What I would say to that is, if you pay close attention to Jesus' body, especially post-resurrection, you'll notice that there's a lot of things that seem to be happening there. He seems to be able to appear in multiple places at once. He seems to be able to change appearance. So on the road to Emmaus, they didn't even recognize him. Mary Magdalene didn't recognize him. He could appear up in the sky in Acts chapter 9. So it would seem that Jesus was not bounded by space and time at that point. He's able to appear in multiple places to multiple people in multiple appearances. He can even pass through walls, for goodness sake. So it would seem that if he's able to do all these things, then being present in the Lord's table seems almost like child's play to him. Okay,
so what I would say to that is, number one, that would be irrelevant to the Jesus whose temporal location was at the Past Supper before he was ever killed and stuff like that, right? So that wouldn't apply to him. Now, in terms of the post-resurrection things, I think you're assuming, he's not bounded by space or time. First of all, there's no mention of him being unbounded by time at all at that point. And I would even argue he's still bound by space, right? But perhaps he's extra dimensional. That could equally explain walking through walls. And, the physicist word would be, he becomes mechanically transparent. That isn't spaceless. He's still bound by space, but he's just maybe not bound by our three dimensions or something like that. But let me ask this then. So in terms of your timeless explanation, think about it this: you're reading into the Lord's Supper narratives that there's one Jesus who's bound by space and time, mentioned by the text. There's also one Jesus who's supposedly post-ascension, who's spaceless and timeless, who's also present. And then there's the accidental properties of the bread and thing. Would you agree that at the very least, that sounds extremely ad hoc? I mean, no one reading the text could come to that conclusion.
I don't know that I would say it's ad hoc. Maybe the more you lean into specific terminology, it begins to sound that way. But as I mentioned before, we're not bound to use specific terminology to explain Jesus' real presence. And this is one of the things that tends to confuse people about transubstantiation. People think that when we use the terms like substance and accident, we're using it in the exact same sense that was being used by Aristotle and the Greek philosophers. But as Bishop Barron noted in his book on the Eucharist, we use that terminology because it made sense at the time to use it. That was the koine, or the common terminology at the time. So we can substitute that phraseology with something different, as long as the underlying concepts remain the same.
Okay. So one thing. So let me ask this about my other critique was that I think your view is implausible reading of this text, and so that implausibility does depend on the a theory of time being true. And maybe we can indulge just a little bit. I indulged you in the Greek, so maybe we can just for a little bit, right? I won't
go ahead
too hard, but okay. So in the first place, would you agree that if the a theory of time is true, the Roman Catholic view utterly fails? You literally can't make present or bring the future to the present in the way you're trying to do with the Lord's Supper here, to saying the future Jesus or timeless Jesus is present here in addition to the temporally bounded Jesus.
Yeah. See, I'm not entirely sure about that one. Maybe it could also be possible that God, essentially takes that event and just I don't even know what the right language would be to use at this point. Maybe sort of like creates it anew at that point. I don't want to use that. I don't want to wed myself to that terminology, because I am sort of treading a little bit into a terra incognita at this point. I don't really know of any Catholic theologians. Maybe someone out there knows of who has tried to wed the idea of representation with a specific theory of time. But I'm just kind of at this point making it up as I go along.
Fair enough. And like I said, I don't want to. Philosophy is my thing. I love the philosophy of time, so I'm not going to press too hard on that stuff. But I would just say this, that the representing thing that would, if it is like a new creation just of the same events kind of thing duplicated, like that's a duplicate. So that would be okay. You're re-sacrificing. Then you would fall privy to that explanation.
Yeah,
it's not.
Yeah, that's why I did. That's why I didn't want to wed myself to that way of explaining it, because I can see how that could begin to go back into the re-sacrificing territory, which I do not want to go into.
Okay. So let me just ask this then, and this is a biblical thing on this time thing. So I presented biblical evidence that I think the Bible says creation displays the a theory of time. Tense is real. And that's in this Lord's Supper, or the Eucharist. Maybe that's 1 Corinthians, actually, where he says, do this in remembrance. Remembering is a past tense. It's inherently past tense. You're remembering something from the past, right? And you do this also to look forward until his coming, Jesus's second coming, which is inherently future tense. So tense, even in this text, is real. You have to adopt an a theory of time. You can't appeal to timelessness or a tenseless theory of time to get out of this.
So under your view, how can prophets have visions of the future?
Because God is omniscient and has middle knowledge and that sort of thing. So he knows all true propositions, including future tense propositions, and then he can reveal that the true proposition to the people. I don't believe in like a Thomas Aquinas view that it's not a perceptual model of time where he's perceiving. That would be like a tenseless theory of time, right? Where he's perceiving, oh, I look to the future and see it. No.
Would you say that future events, even before they happen, are already in some sense real?
No.
So for example, in Revelation 21 and 22, St. John has a vision of the new heavens and new earth and the new Jerusalem. None of those things are real in any real meaningful sense, according to your view.
No, that would be kind of like the opposite of what you're saying. That's God duplicating what the future events will be, but they're two separate things.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, the past doesn't exist either. It has no ontological reality. The A theory is called presentism. So only the present exists ontologically.
And so the future doesn't exist ontologically either in that view then?
No, it doesn't.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know, because even under that model, it makes me question whether the whole theory of time makes sense, because just because my area especially is not physics or philosophy of time. It's more stuff like philology and lexical semantics. But just the way the Bible describes these things, they describe them as real. Like when you look at the vision that St. John has in Revelation, it's so vivid. He could practically be walking the streets of the New Jerusalem as he was seeing the vision. I'm just trying to imagine.
His experience is real. Like, nobody has to deny that he's experiencing something ontologically in the present. But I don't think the Bible is saying he's experiencing the future or something. He's experiencing a vision that's reflecting the propositions God knows about the future and stuff like that. Like is there any reason? Can you think of any biblical reason from Revelation why it doesn't say, oh, and God transported him to the future to see what it looked like or something like that?
I'm just saying that if maybe I have a naive view of biblical prophecy, but the way I conceive it in my head, the way John experiences it in his vision is what it's actually going to be like when it happens.
He's experiencing the future event itself.
Yeah, and that practically makes it real from a certain point of view. Yeah,
I guess it's that's kind of where the difference is. So that works if you have a tenseless theory of time. The B theory of time, you could argue for that. And we could debate that philosophy another time, kind of thing. But I would just say that I think the Bible clearly presupposes that an A theory of time is true, at least for creation, at the kind of thing. And once you have that, your explanation just doesn't work at all. So maybe. Okay. I have another issue that I'd like to ask you about. So transubstantiation involves the change of the substance, right?
Right. So yes, you would say the underlying reality behind the physical objects that you perceive changes.
Gotcha. And so substance in metaphysics and stuff like that. It's saying that substances are things that have a nature, right? They have an individual nature, but there's the kind nature, right? So a kind nature just refers, you have all the essential properties that are essential for being that kind of thing. So dogs have all the essential properties of being a dog kind of thing, or humans have all the essential properties of being a human kind of thing. So when first of all, so let me just ask you, first of all, am I correct that the Roman Catholic view is saying that the bread and wine have all the essential properties of being a bread and wine kind of thing, and those properties are lost, and instead they gain the essential properties of being a human kind of thing, or human flesh, or you said everything. His
basically we would say that the entire person of Christ is present in the Eucharist, which is why we use the phrase body, blood, soul, and divinity. It's not his human nature as abstracted from his divine nature or vice versa. It's the whole person.
Okay, so it is acquiring all of the essential properties of a human kind of thing. A complete human nature is acquired in transubstantiation.
Right.
So here's my problem then, because when we ask what are the essential properties of a human kind of thing, and there is debate among this, but I think the thing that makes most sense is to say it's a person. So it's a substance that has all the faculties sufficient for personhood, a will, a mind, whatever, right? That's embodied in a physical body governed by the human genome. That's the essence of humanity. That's what goes, you're a human being. You're not a human being. But obviously, physically speaking, human DNA is inherently physical. It's something that would be detectable, empirical, and we know empirically it's not there. You can't get out of it by saying, well, there's the accidental properties. Yeah, but it's your view is both and. There needs to be human DNA and bread and wine DNA as the accidentals or something. Or no bread and wine DNA at all, because that's lost. That would be substantive change. So what do you make of that objection?
Well, I mean, the closest analogy that we have to transubstantiation is the incarnation. In fact, it's often been said in Catholic theology that transubstantiation is, in a sense, an extending of the incarnation. Now, think about what the incarnation entails. It entails that the eternal second person of the Trinity became a human being. And if you look at the body of Jesus when he was walking on this earth, it had all the essential properties of a human being. If you pricked him, he will bleed. If you gave him spoiled milk, he'll have diarrhea. Okay, maybe I shouldn't use that one. But anyway, you get my point. If you gave maybe, if you pricked Jesus's and took the blood and put it under a microscope, you're going to see human red blood cells there, and you're not going to find anything under the microscope that would suggest to you that Jesus's body was anything other than an ordinary human body. That doesn't mean that his divine nature isn't there. Does that make sense?
So absolutely, I would say that the properties you mentioned aren't essential for humanity. They're contingent properties, just like I have brown hair, maybe Jesus had black hair, whatever, right? Those are contingent or accidental properties, to use your language and stuff like that. But yeah, I think when we're boiling down the essence, that DNA, that human genome, is a part of the essence of humanity. You've got to have that. And the problem for the transubstantiation view is that, well, you're saying one substance set of essential properties is switched out, transformed into this essential set of essential properties. And at the very least, we can prove one of those essential features of humanity, the human genome, is not present. So doesn't that falsify, I guess, is what I'm trying to...
I guess it has the substance of Christ's body and blood in the sense that, from God's perspective, that's what it is, even if we don't perceive it as such. And also, when we consume it, it has the same spiritual effect as if we are consuming Christ. In a kind of certain way, you could say the proof is in the eating, the way that it affects us at a spiritual level, which is why, you can't really prove transubstantiation by any physical means, unless we're counting Eucharistic miracles, but that's a whole other discussion. And I have tried my very hardest not to use Eucharistic miracles as an argument throughout this debate.
Yeah. Well, if you did, I'd have to call my buddy Kevin Non-Tradicath in to I had him on my show kind of addressing those, but okay. Okay. Well, I just to repeat myself one last time, like that's the thing though. I'm arguing that we would necessarily, if the Roman Catholic doctrine is true, we would necessarily expect to observe the human genome. It's not optional. If you're claiming the human essence is there, then you're going to have physical DNA, because that's part of that's an essential property of humanity.
Okay, fair enough. Again, it'll be very difficult to offer a more substantive response to that without invoking Eucharistic miracles, because I would argue that is an example of God showing us what the real substance is in a way that's more tangible.
Fair enough. All right, I'll let you initiate one now.
Okay. So I think you mentioned that you're starting to lean more towards a spiritual presence view. So would it be fair to say that you hold it the same sense that Calvin expounded it in his Institutes, or would you create some modifications to that viewpoint?
So I wish I could be a better opponent for you, but the truth is I just have no idea. So here's what I think I'm firm based on the research. What's changed? What's changed for me is that I no longer think it's just a symbol. I think that Jesus is specially present at the moment of the Eucharist. Now, what I don't know, does that mean he's present, spiritually present in the bread and thing, or he's just spiritually present in the building? Like when we're doing that Eucharist thing, he's there specially. I don't know. I wish I could give you a firm thing to go over. Yeah.
Okay. Now, so would you affirm then that when a believer partakes of the Lord's Supper, they're in some so you would say that in some real sense they are in fact receiving Christ's body and blood?
In some so you mean through intake? I don't know. Yeah. I mean, because if it's in the bread and the wine or the grape juice, then yes. Obviously, the answer is yes. Now, it depends in what sense. If that's not true, and the memorial view is true, but Jesus is specially present, just not in the bread and thing. What does that mean? How would you get him in that? Or I don't know.
I've tried to study Calvin's view on the Lord's Supper back in my Reformed days, and what he seemed to have envisioned was when an elect person partakes of the elements, in some mysterious way, Christ's body and blood basically comes into him, and it is in some way separable conceptually from the physical eating and drinking, but they happen simultaneously. He also believed that it only happens to the elect. So if a non-elect person partook of the elements, they're receiving just bread and wine. So it's actually closely tied to limited atonement in that sense.
Oh, okay. Because I would say, like, I do agree with that latter part for sure of what, if John Calvin that's what he said, then I agree with that. Like an unbeliever, they're just getting bread and thing. I don't agree with limited atonement in any way, though. But now you said something. Okay, so here's something I probably might agree with, kind of thing, or it makes sense to me, right? So you mentioned that there's a way. John Calvin mentions there's a vague way of receiving spiritual food and drink, and that reminds me of Jesus. Look, he didn't have to physically eat bread and water, but he remember with the Samaritan woman, the disciples were saying, "Look, I have food, spiritual food of which you don't know about," and the disciples refused. Who bought him something to eat or something. But he never had to eat anything physical to obtain that spiritual food. So it could be if if the memorial view is true, maybe we're eating the spiritual food and drink in the same way that Jesus was talking about there. What that means mechanistically, I have no idea. But
right now, under the paradigm that that you're trying to build, in what sense is the Lord's Supper a memorial then?
So I think it is a memorial in the sense of remembering and recollecting. But you are correct. When I looked up the amnesis Greek word there, you are correct that there is something more to it. It's kind of like a vivid, almost like experiencing of it. It's not an ontological reliving in the sense of time travel or something, but even Craig Keener admits that there is this, it's the same word they used for commemorating the Passover, right? And you admitted there was a weaker sense for them. They weren't engaged in time travel with the Passover. They weren't going back to the Exodus and stuff like that. So I think in the same way the Jews were remembering the Passover or reliving or making present the Passover, that's what we're doing today. That there wasn't any strengthening in terms of that remembering.
Right. Okay, fair enough. So let's delve a little bit closer then into 1 Corinthians 11.
Okay.
Now, you said that um, in verse 29, where it says, anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. Now, you made the argument, drawing on Craig Keener, that the body in verse 29 refers to the church as the body of Christ, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so my question regarding that, how does that make sense of the verb diakrino immediately before that? In what sense is that a failure to discern or to recognize the body?
So it's failing to discern the body in the sense that you're partaking in an unworthy manner. Well, what is the unworthy manner? In context, if you read this, it's about, right, why are we self-examining? Because we've got to see, do I have a problem with my brother? Are we divided? And that sort of thing. So that's what I think it means to partake unworthily, is you've sinned against your brother or sister in Christ. And instead of, you're coming to the Lord's table before coming back and unifying, repenting of that sin and unifying together, and then coming back together. So it's what is the unworthy? It's these divisions, unaddressed divisions, which in Corinth was related to the status, right? Rich people, oh, we're not going to hang out with the poor peasants and stuff like that. That's what I think.
Yeah, it's still odd, though, you have to admit, that if that was Paul, that was what Paul wanted to get at, his choice of verbiage is rather odd, because he could have said something along the lines of, for anyone who eats and drinks without maintaining the unity of the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. And that would have driven the point home with a lot less ambiguity. Instead, he uses this word diakrino, which opens up the possibility, at least, of understanding this as a reference to discerning some kind of underlying reality in what they're eating and drinking, which, if you were reading this passage, you have to admit it's very easy to see why someone could read it that way.
So absolutely, I can see. I think it's reasonable. It's a reasonable interpretation the way you're reading it. I don't think you're foolish or lacking discernment necessarily, entirely like that. And it is odd wording. Believe it or what is the reason I am in this stupid state of limbo and stuff like that? It's because of this 1 Corinthians text and the point that you were making your video about the Greek and stuff, where I don't have a full answer to address the Greek words and stuff. It is weird. It seems, I'll put it that way, like weird wording. But I will say this. I do think that Craig Keener's interpretation, read in context, also is reasonable, also makes full sense of the data that we have, including the weird wording. It can work. And I kind of trust Craig Keener on the Greek as much as I trust you. So he knows the Greek. Like I don't think he would make up something that was just contradictory to the Greek. Like, what would you say to that? Why is Craig Keener saying this?
Well, here's another suggestion. Why can't it be both? Because the way I see it, these two interpretations aren't even mutually exclusive of each other. You could argue that Paul is using the word soma ambiguously on purpose in 29, such that both meanings are in view. So discerning the body and blood of the Lord present in the Eucharist, and discerning the unity of the body of Christ. Paul is certainly clever enough that he could do something like that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's plausible and stuff like that. There could be, I mean, obviously there are multiple ways, even if it's just the Craig Keener interpretation that I'm going for, I can envision that there's multiple ways to cause division or something like that. And that's all causing division in the body of Christ or something, right? Like I step on your toe or versus swear at you or something like that. So maybe I would just say, I think Craig Keener would say that, again, in the fuller context, the focus does seem to be, you would agree that the focus is on division in the body of Christ, right? Like he wants us to be unified as one body when we come before the Lord's table.
Well, that is the meta argument of 1 Corinthians as a whole, to be sure, going all the way back to the very first chapter. Now, if you read chapters 9 through 11 of First Corinthians, Paul is pursuing a much more specific argument, which is the issue of food sacrificed to idols. And his argument is that you can't do that because you're also partaking of the Lord's Supper. And he says in 1 Corinthians 10, you cannot partake of the table of demons and the table of the Lord at the same time. And I think that you have to keep that in mind when you're interpreting 1 Corinthians 11 as well. So while the issue of division within the church is lurking in the background still, by chapter 9, Paul has already moved on to another issue, which is how do you partake of the Lord's Supper worthily, and what are the ways in which you can do so unworthily?
Well, okay, so but isn't he talking about the fact that there was this situation whereby rich people were eating the Lord's Supper separately from the poor people and stuff, right?
Yeah.
So division is very much in context still here,
Yeah.
isn't it? Like, and that's why when we self-examine ourselves, what are we examining? If we've got division with someone, if we've sinned against someone, causing division, and vice versa, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, creating division with the church undoubtedly is one way of failing to discern the body, but in the same way, trying to partake of the table of demons, to use the language of chapters 9 and 10, is also a form of failing to discern the body, which supports my view that while Craig Keener's interpretation is possible, it doesn't exhaust the meaning of the text.
Okay, well, let me ask this then. So if your interpretation is one of two or possibly more meanings of this text, right? Maybe it is has multiple applications for failing to discern the body or something, multiple ways you can do that. Why is it we just need to discern the body then? Why not the blood? That's just as important, right? The Eucharist is both the bread and the wine, representing the body and blood. So like that seems weird because just before he mentions you're guilty of the body and the blood, which I can see being metaphorical, right?
I'm gonna borrow a page from your playbook and say it's a metonymy.
Oh, you son of a gun! Okay, you're picking up my tricks now. So.
Exactly.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Okay, maybe it is. Yeah. All right. Yeah. What is there anything else? If I could look at my slides, I can see if there's something else I raised that would be an important point. Okay. No. Yeah. You go.
I think I've covered every base that I wanted to cover. So maybe this would be the point where we can do closing statements. And
yeah, we ran out of time, but I let it continue to go because the conversation was very productive. But we're well out of time. So let's go ahead and move on to the next round since both of you all have exhausted your questions.
Sure.
So now the final phase is going to be 2 5-minute closings, beginning with you, Luis. Whenever you're ready, I'll give you the countdown.
All right. So I'm going to stop the share screen for a moment and start the timer now.
Okay.
So I'm going to start off by going back to the principles of hermeneutics that I outlined in the previous debate, particularly the first principle, the principle of parsimony, the simplest, least convoluted explanation. And, we disagree over what that means, but, I'm not as precise as Dale on this, admittedly, but the way I see it, a lot of it has to do with our intuitions. What seems to be the most intuitive face value understanding of any given text? And it seems to me that if we are looking at the primary text in view, John 6, the Last Supper narratives in the various Gospels, and St. Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians, the most intuitive, non-convoluted way of understanding these passages is that we really are feeding upon the body and blood of Christ, and we do so in the context of the Lord's Supper. So when I read Jesus saying in the Last Supper narratives, "This is my body, this is my blood," I read the word "is" as an identity statement, because that seems to be the most common sense way of understanding the word "is." And you can argue, well, maybe there's other ways of reading the word "is" in those contexts, but those other ways are less intuitive and less straightforward. And I think that anyone who argues for a non-identity interpretation of the words "is" would need to establish that. And there's a lot of things that these texts, they are a major problem if you're trying to defend a Zwinglian memorialist view. In fact, I think the least intuitive position of all is the Zwinglian memorialist view, because even without appealing to the early church, I barely cited the early church at all in my presentation, other than one passing comment on Augustine. It's very easy to see how someone could take these texts and see that it means something more than a memorial. Now, is a spiritual view possible? Well, I will say it's a little harder to refute than a Zwinglian view. But as I mentioned, there are still problems with it, because in order to maintain a spiritual presence view, you'd have to posit that not everyone who partakes of the elements necessarily receives the body and blood of Christ. But Scripture nowhere makes that division. In fact, 1 Corinthians almost seems to argue against it by saying even those who partake unworthily are in some way receiving the body and blood of Christ. And also, again, there has to be some way that Scripture could more clearly communicate the idea that the elements are in some way transmitting to you or communicating to you Christ's body and blood without actually becoming the body and blood. In some ways, the great thing about transubstantiation is that it requires, despite the use of the Aristotelian terminology, it does actually require a lot less imagination to posit. What we are saying is, when Jesus says, "This is my body, this is my blood," it is his body and blood in the realest possible way that you can imagine. And, we can get into the metaphysics of what that entails, but it's that underlying reality that I want to emphasize to everybody. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you for that. Okay. Let me restart the timer. Dale, you all set?
Yep, I'm good to go.
All right. 3, 2, 1.
All right. So yeah, I just want to say thank you again. This was a great debate. In some ways, I have to say thank you to Luis for kind of allowing me to cheat in a way, because unfair to him, I didn't have a position coming in. I thought I did when I originally agreed to. I was staunchly under the memorialist view, but once I started looking into the evidences and seriously considering it, I do have to admit that there's more to it than I realized. I think that there is a spiritual presence in some sense. Whether that presence is in the bread or not, I'm not sure about. But there is a presence. There is definitely a presence during the Eucharist. So that's something I've had to change my mind on. And because of that, I couldn't argue positively for, well, what is, do I agree with John Calvin, or am I a memorialist with a plus spiritual presence not in the bread and drink itself? I don't know. I'm going to have to do further research to figure out where I stand. But I do know what I'm not. I am not a believer in transubstantiation. I do think that the Roman Catholic view is provably, on a balance of probabilities at least, I don't have absolute certainty, but I do think it's probably false. And I gave various reasons. There are various metaphysical reasons, such as the nature of time, the nature of a substance, right? That with that substance swap that's posited, that just don't fit with what I know secularly from with my God-given cognitive faculties about metaphysics. They don't line up. They can't be true. So it's implausible on that basis. Beyond that, with the biblical data, I do think that there are other, especially with the first two texts, John 6 and the Lord's Supper, I think there are more probable or more plausible explanations than supposing transubstantiation to interpret these texts. I think it's more probable than not that that view is false given those texts. I will admit with the First Corinthians text, just in isolation, I think perhaps seeing the presence in the blood and bread itself is slightly more probable than a memorialist view, but there's still a strong counter case to be made. And I laid that out with Craig Keener's interpretation, which makes sense to me. So I'm kind of in this state where it's a mixed bag. I did my best to present the arguments as I know them. But yeah, I hope it was a good debate and people learned some stuff. And thanks for having me on.
All right. Thank you so much for that. All right. So everybody feel free to put your questions there in the chat. Make sure to send them to @Reason and Theology. I have a few for y'all to, interact with. So I'll present it to both of you, but I'll start with you, Dale, first, because I think that you had made a comment to the effect that one would be condemned to hell if they don't embrace transubstantiation from the Catholic view. Did I misunderstand?
No, that's my understanding of what Lewis taught in his presentation. That failure to discern the body, which must mean, or well, at the very maybe not transubstantiation, but you have to discern that the body and blood are in the elements of the Eucharist. Otherwise, you're damned. Is that incorrect? Or I thought.
Well, Lewis, do you want to maybe weigh in on that since he's interacting with something from your presentation?
Right. So failing to discern the body could mean many things. So which is why I said the dividing the church is one aspect of dividing the body, or failing to discern the body, but also failing to recognize the elements for what they really are is also a form of failing to discern the body. And if you consider the cavalier way that the Corinthians were treating the Lord's Supper, it's quite probable that was also in view. Now, could someone be damned for failing to properly understand the Lord's Supper? Now, in Catholicism, we would say that if anyone consciously rejects these things after it has been explained to them, they are anathema. Now, that's not the same as simply failing to understand. It's like an actual conscious rejection of these things after they've been explained to them. So ignorance is one of the things that has to be taken into consideration.
So just out of curiosity, so would I be included there? Because I think I understand the doctrine, but I am saying I have reasons to reject it on a balance of probabilities. So
I will not say any absolute statements. What I will say is that you should probably be careful.
Okay, fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I now have another question for both of y'all. It seems that both of y'all recognize that at least in some of the biblical passages discussed that there are multiple interpretations that are possible. So does this point to the need for an authoritative interpreter? If so, why? If not, why not? So let me start with you, Lewis. Your thoughts here.
In one sense, it is because, and other Catholics have expressed this in much greater detail than I have, but it's not even an issue of how you interpret isolated verses. There's a macro level at which your authority determines the very hermeneutic by which you interpret Scripture. Because just think about it this way, okay? Why is it that in Protestantism you have covenant theology and dispensationalism, right? It's not just because they interpret specific texts differently. but they actually operate with completely different hermeneutics. And those completely different hermeneutics causes them to, apply completely different rules of interpretation whenever they run into different texts. So one of the purposes behind um, an extra biblical interpreter like the magisterium isn't just so that the magisterium can tell you how certain verses are to be read, but the magisterium actually gives you the guidelines for how to understand scripture as a whole.
Okay, and so same question for you, Dale, because it seems like both of y'all recognize there are multiple interpretations possible for some passages at the very least.
Yeah.
What's your thought here? Does it point to the need for an authoritative interpreter, or would a non-authoritative interpretation be sufficient?
So I think it depends on what you mean by authority. So in one sense, I can fully agree. So in my case, my weakness is, look, Lewis brought up several points that I just had to kind of say, I don't know when it comes to the Greek. So in that case, I would need to appeal to an authority like Craig Keener, somebody else who also knows the Greek, and kind of, compare and contrast and look at their reasons. And then I, with the help of an infallible authority, the Holy Spirit, will adjudicate on that reasoning and do my best to, the Holy Spirit, I believe, guides individuals into truth. Does it prove that there's a need for an infallible human authority? I don't think it proves that there's a need for it. I think on one level, if it was true, that would be nice. I mean, that would be great to have. If there is, in fact, an infallible authority, the human being who is infallibly telling me, that's great. That's like living under the disciples and stuff. But for me, it just comes down to a question of, is it true or not? I don't think that we do have an infallible authority. And I don't think it's necessary to have one either, because we have the Holy Spirit that helps us guide us into truth.
And I'm going to get to some chat questions here, y'all. But again, as a reminder, y'all go ahead and put them in the chat. Make sure to put them to @Reason and Theology. I see a few of them that I'm going to grab in just a second. So one other thing that was related. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just a call out there. So I see my buddy Kevin Non-Tradicath in the audience. I mentioned him. He's really knowledgeable on the Eucharistic miracles from a skeptic's perspective. So if you ever want to cover that subject, I can hook you up with him.
So I have one more question before I shift over to the chat questions, just as a point of clarification, because y'all were, Lewis, I think you were talking about how we received the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus in the reception of the Eucharist from the Catholic perspective. Whereas Dale, you were taking the position that would be contrary to that. But you had indicated at one point that would be problematic for you because I think you were saying that Jesus doesn't have a human soul. Did I understand you correctly?
You did. So I forget which council it is. I think it's the 6th one where you guys believe Jesus. You're kind of into Aristotelian anthropology, where Jesus has a divine will and a human soul and a divine soul. I don't think any of that is right. So my model of the Trinity and the Incarnation, I believe that. So the Trinity, what is that? It's one soul, divine soul, that has 3 centers of self-consciousness. So this is called a Trinity monotheism model. One of those centers of self-consciousness, one of those persons, right, became embodied in a physical body governed by a human genome. So there's only one will, one mind, one soul, one spirit or something like that. It's only the faculties of that one divine soul that become embodied. But there's still 2 other faculties, God the Father and God the Holy Spirit, that make up that one divine soul or being that aren't embodied. So you're correct. I don't believe Jesus had a human soul. There's no such thing. There's just souls. There isn't a human mind or a divine mind. There's just minds. And same with wills and stuff like that. So you heard me correctly. Yeah.
So I guess that leads me to then a follow-up question. So yeah, the second ecumenical council, Constantinople I in 381, one of its concerns with Apollinarianism was that it's based on the principle of that which is not assumed is not redeemed. So if we as humans have a human soul, if Jesus did not take on a human soul, he therefore did not redeem humanity to its fullness. What would you say in response to that?
Yeah, I think I would just say so. So this is a view by William Lane Craig, right? So he calls himself a neo-Apollinarianism. So he does avoid technically that heresy and stuff like that. But in terms of that verse that you're saying, I do think that Jesus represented humanity. He had all of the essential properties for being a human kind of thing. He had that human kind nature. And that's really what that verse is saying. Because otherwise, if you press it too literally, I mean, well, what? Jesus didn't have red hair, so I guess redheads are damned to hell. He didn't die for them. Or, you can press it too hard, I think. And I don't, like I said, I don't think I have a human soul. I've got a soul that's embodied in a human body. So, yeah.
I see. I got you. Louis, did you have any comments you wanted to throw in there about that one before I move over?
Nope, nothing on my end.
Okay, so I see a few questions here in the chat. Let's see. Well, they moved on me. Let me grab this one. Okay, so for Louis, can you define the meaning of the word anamnesis?
All right, so I'm going to pull up my verbum again. So this is a resource that I have appealed to a number of times, and it's called the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament by Gerhard Kittel and a few others. And under the section on anamnesis, they talk about the idea of it being a remembrance, but it's not remembrance in the sense of a memory aid. It's a remembrance in the sense that it brings into the present what is being remembered. So specifically in the section on 1 Corinthians 11, so just keep in mind these things do have lexical ranges. So this is how it's used specifically in the context of St. Paul. It says the following: Christians are to enact the whole action of the Lord's Supper. This is the reference to the twofold tuto in the recollection of Jesus, and this not merely in such sort that they simply remember, but rather in accordance with the active sense of anamnesis and the explanation, verse 26, in such a way that they actively fulfill the anamnesis, the making present by the later community of the Lord, who instituted the supper and who put the new diatheke into effect by his death, is the goal and content of their action, in which they repeat what was done by Jesus and his disciples on the eve of his crucifixion. So basically what it's getting at here is that in some concrete way, that event was being brought to the present day in the act of celebrating the Lord's Supper.
Yeah, that's a great enactment. That was the word that I was looking for. Kind of, that's the same word that was used for the Passover, or as an enactment of the Passover kind of thing. In that weaker sense, I don't think it entails that full time travel adventure that Lewis says it does. So, yeah.
All right, Dale. Do you believe it's possible for God to be fully present, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the appearance of person?
So the appearance of one person. So no, because one of those things was soul, right? And the soul contains three persons. So no, I don't think that in the incarnation, it was only one of the persons that became embodied with human flesh. God the Father and that were never such. Now, obviously, in the Old Testament, there were various theophanies where Jesus did not acquire the human nature. He was pre-incarnate, but he did take on the form of a human being and stuff like that. But do I think that there could be one human being that has, truly has three centers of self-consciousness? Could there be a tri-personal person? No, I don't believe in that. I think that's an incommunicable aspect of God. I just don't think the human brain can handle that many faculties sufficient for personhood. And if you appeal to like schizophrenia or something, I don't believe there's a difference between multiple personalities and multiple persons within a single being. So, yeah.
Okay, let's go to this one here. This one is for you, Lewis. Do you think that a robust defense of transubstantiation requires a defense of realism, at least moderate, if not platonic? Are the nominalists more or less out of luck here?
Yeah, I'm not sure that the church has definitely weighed in on this matter, but it does seem to me that a realist view makes the most sense of the metaphysics behind transubstantiation, because, again, not an expert in medieval philosophy, but under nominalism, it would seem that these things are just called uh, body and blood because that's what we decide to designate them. And it seems to me that it's a lot more concrete than that. That in some very real way, this is the actual body and blood of our Lord that we are receiving.
Did you want to interact with that, Dale?
Just basically to say that I agree with Lewis. I think he's right. Yeah. The transubstantiation requires realism in terms of the body and blood.
Susan asks, this one is for you, Dale. Is the human genome essential in the same way as a will is?
Yeah, so I think it is. I think that if we try to distill what the essence of humanity, of a human kind of thing is, I think that having human bodies is a part of that essence. So that the human genome is essential for making me a human being. But the other part of that is that we need to be a person, and persons have various sets of faculties, right? So they have a mind, rationality, logic. They have a will, right? They have free will. They can choose to do this or that. And they have a faculty, a spirit faculty, which is what allows us to relate to God. So there are certain faculties. A will is one of which defines somebody as a person. So in that sense, when I say Jesus, God the Father, and God the Holy Spirit are persons, they're persons in exactly the same sense that I are. They have all the essential faculties of personhood, and that's the same whether you're a human being or not. So the key differentiator that makes me a human versus a divine kind of thing is my body, governed by that human genome. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Lewis, did you have any interaction with that?
Nope, I think I'll let that one stand.
All right, so this one is from AJ. So for Dale, is there anything about the doctrine of transubstantiation that you found convincing?
That I find convincing? Oh, that's okay. Well, so like I said, I think that when it comes to the First Corinthians text, there is some strain with the memorialist view. So in that sense, I do think that there's positing the real presence, at least in isolation, is slightly more probable than the memorialist view. In terms of transubstantiation itself, though, well, I don't find it convincing, but I think it is a smart answer to differentiate between the essential properties of a substance versus accidental properties. And that, again, if it wasn't for the fact that, the essential properties have to be visible for a human kind of thing and a bread or wine kind of thing, and that's swapping is visibly not happening. If you don't take my understanding of what the human nature is, then the substance accidental properties distinction could work as to why, there is no human DNA that's visible or something like that. So I think that was a brilliant move to avoid that issue. But for the fact that, well, unfortunately, the human kind of thing involves things that are inherently visible. You can't escape that and say, well, that's just accidental. So yeah.
Yeah.
All right. There's another one here for you, Dale. Sorry to throw so many your way. Under your view, would a person cease to be a person once they enter heaven without a physical body or human genome?
So no, they would still be a person. But you're correct. I think what he's trying to say is my view is weird. I would say they're no longer human when they're disembodied, and I think that's what Paul's trying to get at. Like they don't have a human soul floating in heaven; they're just a soul. And I think that's what Paul means when he's saying, like, look, we're without our bodies, we're naked, we're incomplete. We don't have a complete nature type thing. So we're a person. We have all the faculties sufficient for personhood, but we're not a human being. We're not a human. Which, yeah.
Luis, did you have any interaction with that?
I'm just curious. In you cited Second Corinthians, and it says that yes, it does say that without our body, we're basically like we're basically naked in a manner of speaking. Although I don't see in the text where Paul says that the disembodied soul is not an anthropos, to use the Greek word. Is there any place that you know of in the Bible that in some way hints at this idea that the disembodied soul is in some sense no longer human?
So no, there's no explicit text that would support my notion of anthropology. It's purely coming from my secular metaphysics and anthropology and stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
All right. So I think we grabbed everything from the chat there. So any other comments that y'all wanted to throw in there, and also put in a plug for anything you want to make the audience aware of coming to you first, Dale.
Yeah. So once again, thank you guys so much for this debate. And I'm not the discount Neo from the Matrix, as one of the fans said in the chat last time. I'm Dale the Real Seeker. So if you can find me on Real Seekers, plural, with an S on YouTube, or my blog is at Real Seeker, singular, ministries.wordpress.com. And I'll just give a plug as well. So I'm also the co-host of a podcast called Faith Unaltered. So, check that out every Friday night at 7:00.
Cool. Luis?
Yeah, well, everything that I am doing, well, almost everything that I'm doing is on Reason and Theology. Tyler Fowler actually asked me to come back on Ancient Faith to do another debate, so it'll be interesting to see, how that turns out. Again, proof that I'm allowed to be on other people's channels. But also, we are gonna do a few more debates on other topics, Lord willing. I'm in touch with a biblical Unitarian as well as a Shi'i Muslim scholar, and hopefully we'll have them both on the here in Reason and Theology at some point in the non-specified future.
Out of curiosity, what are you? So you're debating Tyler on something, or
no? He wanted me to redo the Saints debate with a different fellow.
Oh, okay.
So I'm gonna see if I can update my presentation on that, because you don't want to rehash the exact same one.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah, I look forward to seeing that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank y'all both so much for doing this. This was incredibly productive, both this debate and the previous one. And y'all are both welcome to come back on and debate anything that you want anytime. So thank y'all so much for this.
Awesome. Oh,
everybody hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. Also check me out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. I got a link to Dale's channel and also Lewis's material there in the show notes. So y'all certainly check it out. All right. See you later. God bless.
Bye.